Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We're really excited about the program today. Sorry we can't be here together in person, but as a snow guy, I'm really actually pretty excited to be looking out my window and seeing some snow in DC finally. I do want to take a moment to thank and recognize Isabella Sarmiento and Beth Semmel from our team who did just an amazing job transitioning us to a virtual event seamlessly. So thank you for your expertise and professionalism. Turning to the subject at hand, I don't think I need to tell anyone how AI has really come to dominate the public conversation today. You pretty much can't avoid it. But there is a lot of FUD, of disinformation, even some misinformation out there. And today we're hoping to cut through some of it, particularly focused on the cybersecurity angle. We also want to talk a bit about two papers we recently published from the Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Program. One is focused on the end users of these new AI tools, particularly what they can do today as they're installing these tools to try to make sure they're not introducing new cyber risks into their environment. And another that looks at how governments around the world should approach the governance specifically of generative AI, big topic of discussion today. But we're going to start here in the United States with the landmark executive order on artificial intelligence that President Biden signed at the end of October. And to that end, we're really fortunate to have with us today Ben Buchanan, the White House Special Advisor on Artificial Intelligence. He'll talk with us about the EO. Previously, Ben served as the Director for Technology and National Security at the National Security Council and is currently on leave from his professorship at Georgetown University. Ben has written 3 books on AI, cybersecurity, and national security. So we are all very fortunate to have Ben in the seat he was in when AI really boomed as an issue. He was the driving force behind the Executive Order 14110 on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. Ben, thanks for your effort on that, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Jeff. It's good to be back with the Aspen crew. I also like looking at snow outside of my window. I think the only thing even nicer is looking at snow outside my window when I'm with everyone in Aspen. So we'll have to do that next time, but this is great.
Ben reminds me I left out one of the key elements of his resume. He was a member of our Aspen cybersecurity group before he went into government service. So when we talk about the EO, Ben, before we talk about the what, I wanted to maybe talk about the why, beyond the obvious that it's all over the news. What was the thinking behind it, and what ends were you trying to get at, and how do you think an EO can actually reach those, given the limitations of what executive orders can do?
It's a really important question because I think certainly you don't get an executive order this long and this lengthy if it were just a PR exercise. So there's a lot of substance that drives it. It's probably worth saying the EO is not the first time this White House took action on AI. There's a lot that we've done over the previous years. I think while a lot of the world was taken by storm with ChatGPT and I think we saw it as part of a broader AI story, which large language models are a key component, but just one component. I think the executive order is meant to build on a lot of that foundational work. I meant to position the United States in a position where it's not following and not lagging in the age of AI. And I think one of the key things that resonated with the president and resonated with the team at the White House is this is maybe the first technological paradigm shift that is not at its core driven or built on a foundation of government work. So if you look at the rise of the nuclear age or space age, or even the early days of the internet, the microprocessor, go far enough back, you see railroads too. There's a very strong government hand in those technological paradigm shifts. And this is one that's a little bit different. And I think the president's view was, it's great the private sector is leading it. It's great that all this innovation is happening. We need to make sure there's an appropriate role for government and we're not being left behind by the pace of change. I think that more than anything is the genesis, or was the genesis, for the executive order.
That last point, I hadn't even focused on that, how different the origin of this shift is. So maybe if we have time, we can circle back to. The EO itself has the 8 guiding principles and priorities, I think it calls them. I know we're not supposed to have favorite children, but is there one of the 8 that you think is the most important for people to be focusing on today?
We definitely don't have favorite children in this business. It is worth saying that none of this happens without government talent. And there's the last of the 8 key sections that you mentioned is about getting a lot of talent into the government. And here we've been blown away by the amount of interest. And I think there was a talking point for a long time of, oh, no one good wants to work for the federal government. And how could the federal government ever get AI talent? Or even what I just said of, look, the private sector is driving the train here. And we have been overwhelmed since we launched AI.gov or relaunched AI.gov in the fall with tons of AI jobs. We've been overwhelmed by the number of applications to those jobs, things like the U.S. Digital Service and the like. Now, we've got a long way to go in actually bringing those people in, especially when it comes to appropriations and scaling up the workforce that we need to do. But we've done a lot already around authorities and posting jobs and getting people in to, I think, enable us to do the rest of the things in the executive order. And if we don't have that federal government talent, we know we won't succeed in everything else.
Great. Are there any of the 8 principles and priorities that you think we can make the most progress the quickest on? I know like government hiring notoriously slow. I know there have been a lot of efforts, but either that one or other ones, like where do you think we can have the biggest boom benefit quickest?
One of the places where we know we have to move fast is on a lot of the safety and security issues. So here we stood up the AI Safety Institute at NIST in the Department of Commerce, a place you know very well, Jeff. And it's meant to set standards for AI safety across the board. We've also used the Defense Production Act to compel companies to share their safety test results with us prior to making their systems public. And we used an executive order that I think, again, you know quite well, the Infrastructure as a Service executive order to compel the disclosure of foreign training runs on U.S. soil. So the PLA can't just use U.S. computing power to train an AI system on U.S. soil with American cloud compute. All of those things, the DPA action, the Infrastructure as a Service action, all those things are on a 90-day clock. So those will come due at the end of January, and I think we're going to hit those deadlines to take action there. And then the standards and the like, the first cut on those comes due in July. So we've definitely had an aggressive set of actions here, and the EO is pretty aggressive across the board in fast timelines.
PLA, you mean China, the People's Liberation Army?
Yes, that's right. Sorry for the lingo.
Yeah, no problem. You mentioned NIST. Do you one of the, if you look historically at the public efforts NIST has done on cyber, the cybersecurity framework early in the last decade became an extremely collaborative event. I was in the private sector, so I saw how closely engaged. Are you getting that kind of feedback and engagement? Are you hearing from NIST and others that industry is leaning in and wanting to work with government on these documents?
Yeah, across the board. And even before the executive order, as you know, we rolled out the voluntary commitments from 15 companies where the CEOs and leaders of those companies came to the White House to sort of pledge to the president this is what they were going to do. And that was born out of a desire that even with the absolute breakneck speed at which we push this executive order, it just takes months to get through that process. And we could get more from the private sector companies quickly over the summer in the interim. So that was the start of our collaboration with industry, and it's continued not just with industry but also civil society and more broadly. NIST, as you know, is something called the consortium model, which they've posted a request for applications to the AI consortium. I don't think they've announced who's in it yet, but I think it's fair to say you'll see a lot of private sector companies and a lot of them, the most meaningful ones in the space.
Great. You talked a bit about implementation, the first tranche of work due, I think you said January and then July. There are myriad standards, guidelines, and best practices. I saw, 270 days in there and a bunch of places, 90 days, as you talked about. Let's say they all get done, assuming that NIST and others have the resources. What's next? Like, how do you see the government and the private sector taking those documents and turning them into the improvements in safety, security, and trustworthiness of AI?
I think the documents will be iterative. The technology is moving so fast that it would shock me if we have one set of safety standards and it lasts, for a decade. So I think there'll be some iteration there, and that iteration will be done with the private sector. And obviously, we appreciate the value of consistency for industry. So I don't think it's going to change dramatically, but I think with the technology that's moving this quickly, there will be some continued iteration. I doubt we're one and done there. More generally, though, I think there's a conversation with the Congress that at some point will happen. Obviously, this is an election year, so there's tons of complexity there. But 2024, 2025, I think we're going to have to decide what does AI legislation look like? And we built a foundation in the EO very deliberately for a lot of this, but there's things that only the Congress can do. And I think we're going to have that conversation. And I'm sure a lot of our private sector colleagues are going to be a part of that.
So if I can, that's really an important point. I think that, at least in my experience, a lot of people don't understand about an executive order. You are constrained by the authority the president either has through the Constitution or existing law. You cannot go out and create new authority or put new mandates that don't have that underlying legal basis. And I'm sure OLC, Office of Legal Counsel, spent some time with you making sure there was a foundation for everything you were doing.
Yeah, and OLC spent probably there was more time spent with an order this complex on the legal, mechanisms and the like than there was on actually the text itself, writing text, the first draft of text itself, because they would really work through thousands of edits, and they spent at least a month or two on this, and they really did a terrific job under a lot of time pressure. It's also worth saying one thing you can't really do, with some very narrow exceptions, under executive authority, spend money or appropriate new money. And that's why for things like AI talent and the like, we are doing everything we can to loosen up authorities and direct hire authorities and the like. But if we want to hire a ton more people to do AI, at the end of the day, that is going to be a congressional responsibility.
For sure. So in a few places, the kind of bridging on that, the authority basis of an executive order, the EO does talk about mandatory security baselines or risk management practices. Also, I think there are some nods to potential regulation. If you go back to when cybersecurity became policy issue, the US at least has taken a very voluntary approach, going through some efforts in 2010, 11, 12, led to the NIST cybersecurity framework. It seems like this administration, starting with the executive order 14028 that came out, president signed, I think, in the spring of 2021. There seems to be more of a shift towards, okay, we've tried that. Now we need to focus more on some mandatory baselines. It seems like the EO picks up on that theme. Obviously, it cannot impose new regulatory obligations, but is it accurate to say that even in the AI space, the administration's thinking is voluntary is great, but we also need to make sure there are some requirements, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's right above a particular threshold. So it's worth noting, when I talk about the Defense Production Act and the safety test requirements, that only kicks in when you're basically spending something like $500 million or $1 billion on a single AI system. So what we've tried to do here is preserve as dynamic and innovative an ecosystem below a threshold of security concern. And then above that threshold, say, okay, you've got to share your safety test results with us. We've got to work through this and make sure everything is on the up and up here, because there is, no kidding, national security concern. And I think in the same, this is true for critical infrastructure, where we're trying to have as dynamic an environment as possible, but we want to make sure the appropriate regulators in each of those areas are doing their jobs and updating the regulations to account for AI. In large part because in some of those sectors, our view, I think, is that clear guidance can enable companies and infrastructure providers to move faster. And I think this is a case where a lot of times what we hear from the private sector is they just want clarity on what the rules are going to be and what the standards are. And in the same way that in the early days of the railroad, trains with brakes could go faster because they could also slow down and manage their speed. It's probably the case here that the right set of safety standards and the like, done in collaboration with industry and civil society and all that, enables us to move faster as a country in the age of AI.
Have you had any engagement at the state and local level? I know some states are looking at whether to regulate. Oftentimes, states can legislate more quickly. Hypothetically, if California were to pass a law, it would have national and maybe international impacts. Have you got any response from state level AI commissions and experts, either good, bad, and different to the work that you did in the EO?
Yeah, actually a fair amount. And we've had good conversations with folks. I don't think we're at the point of parsing legislation at the state level and the like and so forth, but I think there's been a lot of interest from states saying, A, thanks so much for laying out a template for us. We see we can build upon it. B, how can we help? Or C, we're just trying to get our heads around this, especially a smaller state that might not have a huge AI or technical cadre in their government. Where can we start? and we've got, as you know, the offices in the White House that deal with state and local, and we've had good conversations through them on a number of these issues.
I want to talk about one of the regulatory issues that's come up globally, really. Transparency is a big talking point, making sure people know that they're interacting with an AI bot or otherwise seeing AI generated content or having some AI driven interaction. In the two papers I mentioned earlier that the cyber program, Aspen cyber program, put out, we touched on both of them, this what we talked about being intelligently transparent, not just pushing notification for notification's sake. And our concern was if people are flooded with disclosures, it's going to become meaningless. It'll become a click through. I think a lot of the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU has caused a lot of requirements to click. I would question how much value it's added to the privacy of individuals. There's definitely a balance. I'm wondering if you view that as a valid concern. We have to do this transparency in a way that it means something to people.
Yeah, this was actually something that came up. I think it was one of the earliest meetings we had on this subject, which is it's meaningless if a dialog box comes up and says this photo was created with a computer. This photo was created or this audio was created with the computer. And you can imagine a world in which AI becomes so ubiquitous that we have to figure out what is actually meaningful and what are we disclosing. One of the things that we have looked towards as we've done this that took a long time, but I think works very well, is the cryptographic HTTPS standards in cybersecurity, where I think a lot of people now know what the green check mark means in their browser, and it's unobtrusive, but it's meaningful, and that people know to look for it and all that. So I think there's instances of transparency done well that we want to mimic, but it's also the case that there's a lot of complexity here, and we need to figure out what exactly we are disclosing, when and how. And there's been a lot of work started by consortium like the Content Provenance Consortium being an obvious one here, called C2PA. But I think it's fair to say that we've got a lot more to do, and happily that's what a task we've given to our good friends at NIST to think through.
Do you think there could be, in this, if you can answer this, maybe a personal question, personal view, are there now, or could we reach a point where we actually should not require disclosure for what you said? If almost every piece of content out there has touched AI in some way, and it becomes a constant thing, are we going to need some threshold? And you talked earlier about this is going to be evolving. This might be evolving as well. So that, I guess, is half the question. The second half is, do you have thoughts on what is the end we want to achieve through disclosure? Because maybe that's how we can get at when do we disclose. It is really like what benefit or what value does it add to the end user to know that there's an AI element here?
Yeah, I think it's certainly the case. So in the voluntary commitments, we built a threshold in. So you don't have to disclose if someone uses an Instagram filter. The disclosure kicks in when you're creating new images from whole cloth or radically editing images with something like DALL-E 3 or whatnot. So that's where the disclosure kicks in from a threshold perspective in the voluntary commitments. I wouldn't want to prejudge where we land as a US government on this, but I think you could probably expect something similar for that. I mean, even when you take a photo on an iPhone, there's so much AI processing that happens of the photo itself that it'd be preposterous to say it is not AI enabled in some mechanism. So I think we agree here that we got to get the technical details right. I don't know exactly where we land in doing so, but very much we think we agree of the premise here. And the goal of disclosure is that folks know what's real and what's not. And if images are meant to be hyper realistic and meant to fool people, then we want it to be disclosed that this is not actually the real thing. And if images are not, or if it's subtle alterations that don't mislead people, then I think we're in a world where we're saying, let's not put up more meaningless dialog boxes. So we have a long way to go in building this ecosystem. Technically, we don't have a ton of time to do it, but I think this is a case where it's in the voluntary commitments and in the EO and the implementation framework as a top priority.
Yeah, if there's one thing we can be confident, it's that criminals and fraudsters will be using AI, too many acronyms, AI to their benefit as quickly as possible. And they unfortunately tend to innovate relatively quickly.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it already. I think we're seeing it already in a lot of these places. And there's going to have to be some kind of societal adjustment to it in the same way that the Photoshop era prompted a little bit more skepticism probably of what we see and the like. And I think that's going to continue, but I also think we have to build an infrastructure around it that is robust to these changing technologies.
Do you think are there any facets of the EO that you think have been underreported? Are there something that you wish people were talking about more? The significance, like just issues that you think may have been pushed down either in the EO actually or more broadly. And in my mind, I have post-quantum crypto as an issue that is still out there as enormous, and we need to make sure we're putting resources behind.
Yeah, there's a whole separate process in the White House on post-quantum crypto. Tarun Chhabra is very involved in that, and like so, a lot of good folks are working on that. I think probably one that I'm surprised hasn't gotten as much attention as maybe it should is the international dimension to this. So we worked very hard, again, even before the executive order, on the international aspects of AI. That included putting together early in 2023 a group of 25 or so nations that helped us shape the voluntary commitments, that helped us shape the EO text and the like. And we continue to meet with those nations, and they're diverse in their geography, their socioeconomic development, their perspectives and the like. So that's been good. We had the first ever international code of conduct on AI at the G7, which rolled out the day of the executive order. That essentially builds upon the voluntary commitments from our companies, which we think was very important. And then we're starting to have conversations now in other international fora. So obviously the UN will be a place of a lot of this work and the like. So I think the international piece, a lot of which is directed by the AI executive order, and a lot of which predated and informed the AI executive order, is a really important part of building a safety regime here, an AI regime here, where standards are interoperable, AI systems are sort of safe, secure, and trustworthy no matter where they're trained. And we have a wide group of nations working together on this. And it's worth saying, for as much as we are eager to work with our allies and partners, we have a line in the AI executive order that we're also willing to work on AI safety with our competitors. And this is something that President Biden and President Xi discussed when they met in San Francisco in November.
That will be an interesting dynamic to watch develop. I guess last question is, I believe you are now the driving force behind the longest executive order in presidential history. I'm wondering if you caught any flack from any of the folks behind the previous record, or are you having to look over your shoulder because you've supplanted? And are you thinking anyone can ever beat your 110 pages?
Well, all I can say is if you don't want a long executive order, don't hire a professor to do it. So, what's the Mark Twain line? I didn't have the energy for a short letter or short executive order. No, I think we've tried to pare this down as much as we could, but I think the length here is not a feature, not a bug, but it is a reflection of the breadth of the AI policy issues. And we have to show up for civil rights, for workers, for consumers, for privacy, for safety, for the international dimension of this, for government talent and the like. And at some level, if you're going to cover the waterfront on something like this, it does require a lot. So we've had to really work hard on implementation, but we're expecting to hit all the deadlines so far. So I think we're off to a good start.
Well, that's great news, and I think a great place to end it. And thank you for leading the effort that did include all those key pieces, because it sends a really important message to the community that you have everything from national security to civil rights to all the other aspects built into it. And so we're moving forward on all of them together. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks for your efforts. Hopefully you can rebuild the sleep deficit or fix the sleep deficit sometime soon, but appreciate all your work here. Great. Well, we are now going to turn to George Barnes. It is my great honor to introduce George. He is now the president of the cyber practice at Red Cell Partners. But you probably know George best from his 35 years of service at the National Security Agency. From 2017 to 2023, he was the deputy director and senior civilian leader of the NSA. As deputy director, he was the NSA's chief operating officer and oversaw strategy, execution, established policy, guiding operations, and managed the senior civilian leadership. Exemplary record of service during some very interesting times. George, thank you for that. And thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts with us today about AI and cybersecurity and snow in DC generally. So let me hand over to George. Thanks again.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And good morning. And thanks really to you, your team there at Aspen Digital, and for all the adjustments given the snow. which is great because it's our first big snow for the year. And also thanks to Ben Buchanan for framing the executive order. It was quite an accomplishment. There's a lot for us to track there, but we're well on our way. And as Jeff noted, given my years of tracking and defending against foreign malicious cyber actors while at the NSA, I thought I would first set the context for the constant cybersecurity struggle we've entered and can't seem to master. The preponderance of our cybersecurity challenges stem from the persistent and intensifying threat from 4 countries and the criminal elements they harbor and or directly enable. You know the list: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We hear it over and over again. The fact that the global community lives on one giant network has naturally made the world smaller, and network-enabled operations have served as asymmetric force multipliers to those who have felt weak relative to our strengths. This dynamic has also sharpened the polarity between international law-abiding liberal democratic societies and aggravated autocracies who have decided to ignore or bypass our international laws and norms. Let me just briefly run across the wave tops of how these 4 countries brazenly challenge us with increasing vigor, resulting in unabated pressure on our cybersecurity community for better defenses. China, under Xi Jinping, has put more malicious cyber pressure on the US and Western world than all other actors combined. Their cyber operations continue to hit every facet of our society, enabling intellectual property theft, identity theft, political influence operations, apparent cyber attack tool prepositioning in our domestic critical infrastructure, and broad-based espionage against every corner of our government. They use our open society and industry-friendly laws to their advantage, setting up networks, service providers, and supporting technologies right here in our country. Yet they preclude reciprocal access by U.S. industry, except in highly controlled edge cases such as Apple's agreement to establish a wholly independent infrastructure there. Putin's Russia has used the cyber domain to extend and intensify its traditional statecraft of attempting to destabilize any nation it deems a threat and to coerce nations it wants to control. We've all watched this play out in its ongoing campaign against Ukraine, but also recall their past cyber attacks on Georgia, Estonia, and yes, Ukraine. The GRU, FSB, and SVR all have highly sophisticated cyber services, which have all wound their way into our country. Putin commissioned the now deceased Prigozhin and his troll farms to launch major democratic election interference campaigns against the US and myriad European countries, with the US 2016 general election serving as their hallmark endeavor. And let's not forget that Russia proudly serves as Grand Central Station for the world's largest concentration of ransomware actors, hitting our hospitals, schools, small governments, and untold numbers of companies. Turning to Iran. Most of their cyber operations are conducted against Israel, but they continue to pursue retribution operations, election meddling, and influence operations against our interests. And then there's North Korea, which has somewhat mastered network operations aimed at revenue generation, either by ransomware operations or direct theft and extortion from banks and cryptocurrency outlets. None of these actor sets are sitting still. They have honed their tradecraft and increased their scope and scale of their operational focus. They've capitalized on earned efficiencies and nominally permissive environments with little to no repercussions. Accordingly, they continue to increase investment in cyber operations as main components of their defense, intelligence, and economic machines. Moreover, China fully understands the force multiplying effect of advanced technologies and has not been bashful in its pursuit of advanced computing technologies despite our efforts to stem the tide. Just yesterday, Reuters reported on successful efforts by China's military and government to acquire NVIDIA GPUs that are currently banned for sale to China. The numbers uncovered were relatively small, but actual numbers are likely to be much larger and indicative of China's quest to compete. All in all, we know China, and we know they push for realization of their strategies by whatever means necessary. This invariably correlates to actions which challenge the cybersecurity posture of our industrial base across literally every sector. And as good as we've gotten across industry and government in identifying, eradicating, and defending against these actors, we remain woefully vulnerable and are continuously suffering losses. So where are we on this journey? Society's ever-increasing dependence on ubiquitous connectivity, the Internet of Everything, and dynamic big data-driven decision-making has created an unquenchable thirst and hence fuel for ever-increasing optimization. Speed, efficiency, and increasingly resiliency are main ingredients for most things in our global society. National security decision-making, dynamic defense operations, global health incident response, natural disaster response, new products time to market, competing first mover advantage, and global supply chain management. The list goes on. The need for speed drives most other variables, and our network-enabled, data-driven lives seek to squeeze out inefficiencies that impact it. This quest has propelled the accelerated development of and application of highly advanced algorithms and enabled by marvels in high-performance computing at a pace which has now prompted us to consider whether we're ready for the power we have unleashed. Of course, the fall of 2022 was not the dawn of artificial intelligence or its application in cybersecurity solutions. The cybersecurity community has been steadily increasing AI-enabled analytics over the past 10 years or so. Most of you will recall or will have lived through the prior waves of hype. I recall the advent of the incessantly applied AI/ML term that started pervading the tech sector buzz circuit about 7 years ago. Those 4 letters seem to be sprinkled on everything, almost like salt and pepper. That said, the advance of AI and ML-enabled analytics and decision logic started to steadily enhance the efficacy of commercial and government cybersecurity solutions. So there was substance to all that hype. All that said, we were not alone in the application of these technologies against cybersecurity challenges. The scope, pace, and ever-increasing sophistication of foreign malicious cyber actions against our national interest forced NSA and our mission partners to intensify our efforts to augment our analysts with technology to better identify, mitigate, eradicate, attribute, and defend against these threats. In parallel, U.S. and allied industry was developing ever-increasingly sophisticated capabilities, and we forged public-private partnerships for enhanced defense against the dark arts. The good news is that we're better than we've ever been. The challenge is that a new race is now underway. Now, the development and global release of the various large language models supporting generative AI has changed the world forever. And while untold applications stand to enhance the far reaches of our global society, those reaches unfortunately include the realms of the nefarious actors who will, as they always have, use the power of new technology to intensify their badness. Hence, we can never turn back. Effective cybersecurity will require the power of integrated AI, while bad actors will continuously use it to enhance victim discovery, penetration, persistence, obfuscation maneuvers, and malware implant feature set enrichment. And while generative AI will support bad actors and defenders alike, the discipline of non-repudiation will take on tremendous significance, as LLMs will be used to generate highly authentic fake content for malicious cyber operators masquerading as trusted members of a network and swapping in data or information to displace original content. So as we look forward into this phase of globally accessible and ever smarter LLMs, which are complementing myriad other variants of AI algorithm maturation, we must understand and prepare for some basic realities and challenges. The sophistication of the threat will intensify. The speed of threat actors will dramatically increase. Human defenders are already overwhelmed and require machine teammates just to stay at their current level of efficacy. Malicious operators will use their machine teammates to find the weakest links in victim networks more effectively. Entities who have struggled to defend themselves will be increasingly vulnerable. This set includes private operators and municipalities operating critical infrastructure services, as well as many organizations that are ready prey for ransomware attacks. Today's panel and the discussion of Aspen Digital's new papers will give us all points to ponder and considerations for bolstering our defenses through the application of these new technologies, coupled with thoughtful contemplation of how our global community should harness the power of this technology for good. Thank you for your time, and sorry we couldn't be in person today. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, George. Really appreciate the plug for some of our recent work and more broadly, the excellent overview that you provided to us for context for this next panel. So next up, I'm really excited to welcome representatives from industry and civil society, and we'll have a forward-looking discussion about where we go from here. As we saw, George and Ben covered the evolution of AI over the past few years, as well as the recent White House EO. Ben highlighted how this tech revolution is different from others and that the government role was not as prominent. He also highlighted the need for some private-public discussions, which we'll touch on momentarily. George shared how these technologies have been used by authoritarian regimes to subvert democratic ideals, from ransomware to election meddling, extortion to espionage. And I'm really excited to dig into what that future looks like. So thrilled to be joined today by Bobby Stempley of Dell, Amanda Walker of Google, and Govind Shivkumar of Omidyar Network. Each brings a really valuable perspective to all of this. Excuse me. And so I'll invite each of you to introduce yourselves and specifically talk about your role and how it's evolved over the past year or so. Bobby, I'll turn it over to you first.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate the panel and the conversation that we intend to have. I think it's a really important topic. I am a business unit security officer at Dell Technologies in the product organization. So think about me as the security strategic partner to the part of the company that builds the things that are innovating and transforming across a wide range, across the wide range of security disciplines, from product security to cybersecurity to insiders, insider risk. So it's interesting to me when we talk about how the last year has evolved. It certainly has constantly felt like the speed button on everything we're doing continues to ratchet up. Every time I feel like we're running really fast in the security community, something new happens, and that speed button really gets ratcheted up. And I think for me, that has meant that we have to regularly stop, take stock, and look at where are the most logical points of intervention in order to really engage. Right, this has long been a problem of scale and capacity. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation with the colleagues today, and I'm glad we were able to do this even in this remote format.
Excellent. Thanks, Bobby. And you mentioned those points of intervention. Certainly there are industry perspectives on this. We saw some of the government perspectives. I would love to turn it over to Govind, who brings a civil society perspective, to introduce himself and also share how his job has evolved over the past year.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Aspen, for hosting us. Yes, I'm Govind Shivkumar. I'm a director in the responsible technology team at Omidyar Network. And Omidyar Network is a philanthropic investment firm that seeks to change current social initiatives. And our life has significantly changed over the last year. We've announced a new point of view to ensure that generative AI is in the service of society. We've announced a new 30 million initial investment fund, and that'll bridge the gap between industry, civil society, and policymakers, broadening the Gen AI infrastructure. So overall, we feel that to echo Bobby, I don't think we've seen the pace of movement be so significant and so fast. Over the past 1 year, I think we have seen technological changes happen every hour, every day. We have seen policy implications and reflections from all corners. So we hope 2024 sort of continues not just the pace, but also more depth in these conversations and primarily implementation of all the ideas.
Absolutely. Thanks, Govind. And Amanda, I'll turn it over to you. I'm assuming you've also experienced this pace over the past year.
Oh, yes, it's been quite exciting. Hi, I'm Amanda Walker. I lead the applied research team in privacy, safety, and security at Google. And the easiest way to describe what we do is our job is to find new tools to add to the toolbox for people working in this area. So we've been early adopters and innovators in AI for a while at Google. Keeping up with some of the acceleration over the last couple of years with LLMs and so on has kept us on our toes. So thank you for
Excellent.
inviting us to be part of the conversation here.
We're thrilled to have you. Thanks, Amanda. All right, so I know we only have 40 minutes. We have a ton of ground to cover. So I want to invite all of our panelists. You can certainly share your thoughts, agree with other panelists, disagree with other panelists, or elaborate on anything that your other panelists have shared. It should be a great discussion. I'll start with a few general questions, and then we'll move into more targeted questions as we go. Bobby, I'll start this one with you and then open it to the others. We just released a paper discussing the kind of two futures, if you will, of AI, both the good place and the bad place. I know you had worked on that paper a bit, and so I'm curious, after being a part of that, who do you think AI will advantage more, defenders or attackers?
Yeah, so that's a perennial question, I think. And with any technological innovation, we ask ourselves this question, and I think today I'm certainly seeing the advantage to the defenders more than the attackers. There's lots of bad things out there. Don't get me wrong. I am in no way saying that there aren't advantages to the bad place or to the dark side or whatever framing we want. But I think the real question is, how do we ensure that sustains, right? That we can take advantage of the speed and the innovation for defenders, changing not just the dynamic of the engagement, but of the environment themselves, itself that's being defended, and really have the potential with this innovation to change all of the different phases in the environment, which makes it so different than many of the other innovations that we've had in automation.
Absolutely. I really appreciate a degree of optimism to get us started. Amanda, do you share
that? It doesn't hold, don't worry.
I think I'm with Bobby on this one. We're seeing big advantages to defenders. It is an arms race. There are always innovations on both sides of the coin. But we're really, there's always been an asymmetry between attackers and defenders, where defenders have to see everything. It's called the defender's dilemma. And we're seeing some real traction on that with applying AI just to the scale of what we need to keep track of, what signals we need to find, what we need to do with them. So I would say so far we're in the defend. It helps defenders more than attackers, and we certainly hope that continues.
Absolutely. Govind, over to you. What are your thoughts?
I actually have a different perspective. I think it's currently, at least in the short run, technology such as this, I think it's all to sort of, probably I'm butchering William Gibson's often quoted phrase, right? The street finds its own use for tech. So I also think a lot of these attacks are not being reported, right? As defenders, as people who invest in civil society industry, we have to follow the rule of law. We have to uphold reputation. We have reputations to keep. So we generally, one, are optimistic, but also tend to follow protocol and rules. Versus attackers are not bound by any of these constraints. And often these attacks are not reported if they're small enough, right? So small phishing claims, small ransomwares, often people probably just don't report them. But I think, to sort of probably preempt your second question, I think in the short run, any new tech such as this, which is sufficiently powerful and enables actually lower skilled attackers to sort of punch above their weight, will benefit them. But in the medium term, we often find both specific solutions and systemic solutions through policy, through specific technological interventions. And it's a stalemate. And in the long run, defense always wins, right? Because at the end of the day, the defense has more support, better vision, more cohesiveness. But the playground moves. So probably in 2 years, we'll be probably talking about a new form of tech, and then the cycle will begin again. So that is my sort of overall reading of the situation.
Thanks, Govind. And Bobby, curious if your optimism holds across a longer time scale.
I think for me, the longer time scale is where things got, well, it's impossible to have a clear view over a longer time scale given the world we live in. But the piece that I see is the transformation and innovations outside of the security domain that change the way adversaries act, that we need to understand inside the security domain so that we can gain that view. And I find in many instances, that's where we end up getting caught off guard. And so, this technology and innovations in general are changing the nature of everything we do, the nature of how we work and how we live and how we interact. And so understanding how all of those are going to co-evolve and what that's going to mean for us as users, as IT decision makers, as security defenders is, I think, and it's really an unclear picture going forward. And so it really means we've got to have agility and resilience as individuals and as communities in order to adapt.
Absolutely. Amanda, I'd love to go over to you and see how the time scale maybe shifts some of this, in particular, maybe pulling on that thread around incentives for attackers and how that might change over time.
It is certainly changing over time. This ebbs and flows, and we're seeing it ebb and flow a lot faster. So, one sea change we're seeing that some of us running large platforms have seen early, but is now, I think, penetrating to the rest of the industry is it's no longer a series of incidents. It's a rolling wave. People are trying new things all the time. Some of them work, some of them don't, and you really need to stay on top of it. So the pace has certainly changed, even if sort of the essential nature of things hasn't. So I don't know if we want to segue into your second question, but I think there are some really interesting patterns here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, in addition to the deluge of new attacks that we've seen, we've also seen a ton of new opinions, a ton of new kind of headlines around this. Some of these things are pretty extreme. They can go right to doomsday. Some of them are more moderate. So curious for everyone, what is something that folks are getting wrong or not quite right around cybersecurity and AI? Govind, I'm happy to pick on you first.
Sure. I think one of the things we probably are, I wouldn't say getting wrong, but we need to change our perception and our perspective is what I call anthropomorphism, or projecting human values on machines and non-humans, and getting inspired by all the movies that we have watched and getting influenced by them and letting imagination take over and fill in the blanks rather than saying, here are the risks and here is what we can do about them, right? Just like or here are the harms. The other thing that we don't really quantify is risks are often very theoretical, whereas harms are real, right? They impact people. But also what we're getting wrong is we need to have an affirmative vision, right? Any form of technology in the long run helps create a more positive ecosystem under which many different opinions can thrive, and focusing on one opinion and focusing only on what adversaries can do with this technology, which I know sort of is what I initially started with, but not how we can also use this technology to create defensive mechanisms, right? If misinformation is a problem, we can also focus on watermarking as a solution. If adversarial attacks do happen, but can we now automate large quantities of data and do analysis like never before as human beings now can be done by machines? So I think that's what we are getting wrong, in a sense, how we can use this tech to really push back on some of the existing narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard to maintain that balance in this conversation, definitely. Bobby, how about over to you? Any areas that you see commonly maybe not quite right or getting wrong in headlines or other places?
Yeah, it's really easy to get absorbed in the hype because the innovations are happening so quickly, and I think two things get lost amongst all of this. The first one is it has always been and will continue to be about the data. Right. And we've very quickly, very easily get focused on container security or on sort of the technical components, which is incredibly important, but it has always been and will always be about the data and where that data is and what is intended to do. And so really understanding that and continuing to stay focused on that, I think is really important for organizations, which means it's still very important to focus on the fundamentals in your environment as well. And again, it's really easy to get really focused in the hype and move down a journey that leaves you to not stay grounded in some of the more fundamental issues that need to continue to be addressed. With that, though, I think a comment I made earlier is still true, and that is that there's an awful lot of innovation that's going to happen outside of the IT environment that's going to create incentives for adversaries. And then we're going to see it change the attack patterns. And so really, we have to sustain an understanding of what that's going to look like as well, so that we can have a good sense of how our threats are going to change.
Absolutely. And Amanda, over to you.
Sure. I think that the thing that people get wrong most is going to extremes. You know, it's either the end of civilization as we know it, or it will completely transform civilization into something unrecognizable. I think it's somewhere in between, like the internet revolution, like what we used to call the computer revolution, if people remember that. It'll change incentives. It'll change the economics. Some things, it'll magnify some capabilities that used to be impractical, or only if you had huge amounts of resources, you can now do on a phone or a gaming PC. It'll amplify that, you know, on both the attack and defense sides. So I think we're all in fairly strong agreement here, but we do have to avoid going to one rail or the other. It's new technology. It'll change things in ways we don't expect, can't anticipate. Humans don't change as fast as technology, and so how humans are using it is going to be some of that's going to be familiar. You know, people are already using it for fraud and other things that they've used previous technology for. So it's not as much a strange new world as I think people are worried about. But we do need to stay on our toes.
Yes, absolutely. So a theme I think I heard throughout is finding that balance and not going to either pole immediately, which brings me to my next question, which I think is going to be a little tough to answer in any sort of long-term timescale. But we did hear earlier from our government colleagues about kind of the policymaking process and the need for that private-public partnership while regulation catches up. And we've seen a ton of these voluntary commitments and kind of self-governance efforts across the private sector. From each of your perspectives, what policy actions would be helpful in getting us on track towards a future where defenders have that advantage? So Amanda, I'm happy to go right back to you. I know Google was a signatory on the voluntary commitments particularly.
Yeah, I think that some of the most valuable parts of that are agreeing on sets of principles, agreeing on a taxonomy of ways to use AI, as we discover novel attacks or defenses, how we share that information, how we compare notes, how to do adversarial testing responsibly. We've been also championing the idea of an AI red team, sort of like we've had security red teams for a long time. We've got one internally that is starting poking and prodding as we've been releasing products that use AI. We encourage this. It's one of the best things that we think you can do. And I think CIS has done a great job of sort of leading the way here, of saying, yes, all the same cybersecurity things that you did for software, do for AI as well. They're still important. And so setting that example, I think, and promoting some of those guidelines has been really helpful already. And I'd love to see government continue with that.
Thanks. And yeah, I think having that common dictionary of terms and standards and everything goes quite a long way, even just to have the same conversation across the table. Bobby, how about you? Any policy actions that you would like to see to get us on track?
Yeah, I think that idea of frameworks and principles and really getting agreement and conversation around those becomes an important first step. We use words to mean fundamentally different things in different areas here, and that I think impedes our ability to get the outcomes that we're looking for. So I agree with Amanda in terms of focusing on taxonomies, principles. I think that open shared dialogue continues to be incredibly important. There are a multitude of players, and given where we are today and the path that we don't know where the end will lead us to, making sure that we have the players at the table for the conversation really becomes an important mechanism. And I think finally, keeping the end in mind becomes more important now than ever, because the mechanics are going to evolve rather rapidly, and we want them to evolve rather rapidly in the environment. That means we've got to really focus on what kind of outcomes we're trying to drive towards and provide an awful lot of clarity around that. And so I think the dialogue between civil society, government, and industry has to really be framed in those terms.
Excellent. And that was a good segue over to Govind, who I know worked on our global paper a bit and taking a look at how we keep the end in mind across these different regulatory frameworks we're seeing. So Govind, anything to add?
I would say, I think between the EO, between the Aspen papers, and between a whole host of AI governance mechanisms and reports already, I think there is a lot of material out there, right? I think we are at probably peak AI governance from a reports and reading a lot of documents standpoint. But much of the infrastructure actually is private, right? So there's only so much policymakers can do. So it's imperative to work closely with industry and civil society, something like I think what JCDC did with software, and having industry partners, because whether we like it or not, I think industry and civil society are at the front lines of this defense mechanism. The second, I think the EO already lays down priorities. The question is coordination and allocating the resources, right? It's a question of money, a formal law at some point, and it's a question of talent, as Ben was alluding to earlier, right? So I think there's a lot of documentation out there. So the question is, how do we implement? How do we enforce? How do we execute? How do we coordinate? So the devil is in the details. And I think the policymakers probably have done a fantastic job of responding to the situation faster than ever before.
Absolutely. Well, with that provides a good segue for me to turn back to our industry colleagues. So Bobby, across all of the different technology revolutions we've seen in the past 30-ish plus years, how is the open accessibility of AI tools changing things for the hardware and software industry?
It's I think the question about how it has is one, and how it will is, I think, still partially an unanswered question. We're certainly seeing continued innovation at all levels of hardware and software, right? You're seeing great innovations at the chip level, all the way up through transformations in the PC space, all the way into sort of into data center operations. We're seeing innovations in how software is actually built, right? I sort of go back to, it's all about the data. In the end, the data is the software is the data. We're creating this world where we are no longer in a deterministic space, and it is no longer easy for us to say, put a fine line on what is hardware, what is firmware, what is software, and what is the data that we're processing on. And there's real opportunity space in that. But what at least we're seeing is that the innovations are happening at all levels. It's not just what's happening in the core, in sort of large centralized locations. Inferencing it moves out to the edge, and so what the power on your PC, the power in your phone, the power in your edge devices is really phenomenal in this landscape. And really, what the other thing this is forcing or continuing a journey for companies is to really understand how we do some of the basics in the hardware space as well, right? How do we think about power management and sustainability, which, it's sort of a tangential comment to many of the security related items, but at some level you think about availability as a core security principle, and what is that going to look like in a world where we have to have this kind of power in a variety of places. So there's innovation at all levels going on in hardware and software, in part because of this transformation.
Yeah, it's definitely a very integrated ecosystem. And Amanda, in particular, I think you had touched on some red teaming efforts. Would love to broaden that question a bit and just hear a little bit about what Google is doing to try to harness AI to improve cybersecurity.
Sure. One thing I'll notice is this isn't new. We've been using AI to protect Google systems and users since about 2011. And we started by using it to detect hackers on internal networks. And our red team is regularly poking and prodding and coming up with new techniques that we can test out against our own systems. So it's become an essential part of that tool set. We do think that AI really tilts the scales to give a decisive advantage to defenders based on that kind of experience. Coping with complexity is the big one. One of the problems with security breaches in general is that the digital domain is just too complex for humans. It's too hard to see the whole picture, especially if you're one person and your pager just went off. So AI can help us cope with that and rapidly reason about, okay, what just happened? What do I need to know? Even when the data sets are very large and the systems are very complex. Most recently, we have been using LLMs for this. We are using it to help bridge the talent gap. So having novices, early career folks, and experts using the same tools, learning from that, is helping spread the knowledge, doing things like taking logs and attack graphs and making them human understandable. If you haven't had a decade of experience looking at these kinds of artifacts. And so that's a real force multiplier that we are seeing. It also helps reduce toil. Because of the huge attack surface, doing things like, okay, doing an after action report on what just happened for your management and your execs, or disclosure to a regulator, having AI help with that and summarize things, do a first draft. We find this is especially important for people who are not necessarily fluent in the language that the company uses, because we have people all over the world. And so having AI assistance on a bunch of this helps a lot. And then helping stop it, helping mitigate it. We're very early days on this with things like our security AI workbench, but we think there's great potential for adapting to attacks as they happen, bringing in humans. I think the purely automated defenses are still a myth, but having smarter defenses, having better signals than, oh, my pager just went off because some monitoring console saw something go out of range, is a huge help, and we see great potential there.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are still many efficiencies to be discovered with this new technology.
Absolutely.
And overlaying them with existing tools, certainly. Govind, would love to go over to you and switch gears a little bit. Much of the world, despite I think all of us being in the AI space, is not focused on AI day to day. And so Omidyar Network does a ton of great work in supporting communities. You're the director of responsible technology within that. Are there things that civil society groups should be doing now to fortify themselves from these AI-related cybersecurity risks, even when they don't have that expertise maybe in-house or that focus?
Yes, I think sort of harking back to the conversation saying most of the infrastructure is private, right? So non-state actors are at the front lines of defense. And I think one thing that civil society actors should and can do is move beyond chatbots. And there are many other threats, and then there are many other tools available, and there are many other ways that AI, or particularly generative AI, can be helpful, right? Particularly to fortify themselves. Taking advantage of open source cyber tools. And I know, there are certain risks that come with open source cyber tools, but one is to not talk in silos. Traditionally, what happens is industry tends to talk amongst themselves and tends to create products and services which are far ahead. And civil society tends to talk about specific harms, specific issues, but there should be an open dialogue with industry to say how we can fortify ourselves. What are the specific tools? What are the micro courses we can take? What are the tools? Where are they available and how can we use them? And there are specific risks that certain civil society organizations will face, and you will need specific solutions. So I think one is to participate in conversations where technologists, industry leaders participate along with civil society. And I think Aspen has done an excellent role historically, and we should find more such platforms. And it's also, I think, incumbent upon Amanda and Bobby to include civil society actors and in the conversations they are having and informing and educating them, right? I think often we leave this role to philanthropy and government, and there is only so much resources available there. And the pace of technology that industry can move at is unprecedented, as we have witnessed in the last few months. So I think rather than suggesting specific fortifications, I would say just open dialogues, talk to industry, and find what specifically works, and look at resources which are available, often free, as open source.
Absolutely. Well, that was a good invitation for me to go right back to Amanda and to Bobby. Would love to hear from you all about any focus that your organizations have on civil societies, both your actual customers and non-customers, and if there are any specific resources or tools that are low or no cost that you might refer them to.
Yeah, so one of the things that is very much in the Dell ethos is the construct of bringing others along. And so Govern's call is really important because we have a range of volunteer activities or engagement functions that help, including we have a team of individuals that we train that helps then go into schools and makes a part of helping under-resourced schools bringing their security functions up. And so, really this is a question of how do we ensure that we are reinforcing the dialogue with civil society partners about what is the policy landscape, and ensuring that they're at the table and choosing the venues such that they have the players that we need at the table, and then providing the support for the individual entities as they are facing the same transformation.
Excellent. And Amanda, over to you.
I think the biggest thing that we can do here is have the conversation out in the open. Not a lot of backroom discussion between between private sector, between public sector. We all have different views that combine. We would like to see more things like Frontier Model Forum, where we have not just us, but have everybody from industry, everyone from government, everyone from civil society looking at these developments, saying, okay, what does AI safety mean? What does, ultimately, government regulation is often motivated by keeping people safe from threats. Okay, what does safety mean in the face of this? How do people's expectations adapt as they get new tools? I've seen the sort of public attitudes about things like ChatGPT change over a year. It's magical. Oh, okay. After using it for a year, okay, it's not as magical as it looked. And so tracking that and having that discussion and keeping up with, okay, civil society is grappling with these things just like industry and government. What are the important things that are emerging? What are the things that are receding into the background as, okay, that looked like it would be important, but is not now? I think keeping that conversation going and identifying best practices where we can, identifying sort of the concerns of each sector of society is really important.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful to make sure that everyone has a chance to have a seat at the table and
Absolutely.
Conversation. Great. Well, I realize we're starting to get low on time. Amanda, I have one more question for you, and then we'll turn to a lightning round for all of our panelists. Amanda, I know you have a background in privacy, and so very curious just to hear from you about how you see AI impacting the future of privacy, at least as it stands today.
It's a subject near and dear to my heart. Like anything that processes or can process personal information, AI does raise some privacy questions. And so some of the same principles that we've developed for data in general, like transparency, control, data minimization, all of that, they aren't new, but they should be feeding into AI governance as well. But how to do that is not always clear. So I think we need to work more on clarity on what these privacy concerns that have been developed over the last however many years should and do apply to AI. I think there's great potential to advance privacy goals with AI. And I don't think we're talking about that enough. We're using it now internally to get a much better understanding of privacy-related feedback that we get from users or compliance issues, things like that. We have the Google Play Store. It has more data than I can describe about users' comments about products. How to take that and distill out and say, okay, here are the top 3 privacy concerns that the user community across the world has expressed about this, and turn it into actionable feedback has turned out to be a really powerful tool, and would not be practical without AI. So, I mean, I could monologue on this for a while, but I think that like the security side, I think AI amplifies both attacks and defense. AI gives you some traction against traditional privacy guarantees or privacy techniques, but it also brings new ones, and we should be leaning into those.
Absolutely. Much like that attacker and defender tension that we discussed at the outset.
It's the same balance.
We'll use
yes.
technology. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, great. So lightning round before we transition to our final session. Govind, I'll start with you for this question. What can organizations do right now today to make sure that they are not introducing new major risks as they deploy AI tools or interact with AI tools?
Yeah, I think till we have formal regulation, Katie, I think we probably should look at indirect means of governance, right? So if you're using open source models, make sure they're responsible, which means better, cleaner licensed data sets, use techniques which help uphold privacy, like Amanda mentioned. There are technological interventions, like perhaps using synthetic databases as a form of preemptive governance, and using audit mechanisms to ensure when you procure and deploy these technologies, you are well informed, and probably as a framework, perhaps don't get FOMO. I think the technology is here to stay, but you can be careful, have proper governance mechanisms, and still win. Second, I think we should think about as a child does, be curious, not afraid, but at the same time, think about deploying these technologies in sandboxes, small environments to test and stress test the results before you start deploying and adopting and using APIs without fully understanding what the second and third order effects are for your firm, for your individual use cases. A simple hygiene could be just don't copy paste stuff into chatbots, which could then release sensitive information into the world, and which you can't control. Right. So some hygienic stuff should go a long way. That's where I would be.
Back to basics, definitely. Bobby, over to you.
Yeah, back to basics is, I think, is a really important framing for it. I think it's interesting and important for us to separate what's new about this from what's just the same, perhaps either made faster or sort of more broadly, and not lose sight of the security guidelines and principles and actions that you would take, whether this was the technology or not. So Govind's comment about not just copying things into chatbots, don't just copy stuff into Google search windows or other sort of other mechanism in that space. I think for me, the other one is really recognize and focus on some of those other important things, right? What is the threat model that you're operating under? How does this change that threat model? Threat modeling is can be a complex activity, but it can also be a really simple activity. And so, start with the simple and evolve through. And I think that's really an important place there. And don't get lost in the security, innovation, false choice. You can do both. It involves being thoughtful, being clear, and being skeptical. And those are, I think, important principles for all users in the world today, not just for the security professionals.
Absolutely. I appreciate the balance of being clear and skeptical there, for sure. All right, Amanda, I'll hand it over to you for the last word before our next panel.
Sure. I think that balancing speed and care is going to be very important. Nobody wants to be left behind. Everyone wants to use the latest cool stuff, and there are big advantages to applying AI to problems that you haven't been able to get traction on before. But we think it's really important to keep in mind that this does create some new attack surfaces and concerns that your current cybersecurity regime may not match. Things like prompt attacks, prompt injection, data poisoning. It's really important for, if you're going to deploy AI, to know what you're deploying, what was used to train it, what data you're using to perform inference on, and if you're delegating a decision, especially if you're delegating a decision to the output of a model, know how it can go wrong. There's a lure of automation, but we've seen some things in the press about, oh, I had an LLM do a bunch of legal research for me. It's like, well, it produced something that sure looks like it, but those cases don't actually exist. This kind of thing is something that, if you're deploying AI and you're relying on the results, you're responsible to make sure it's giving you what you think it is. Yeah. So the mixture of speed and care is always difficult, but it remains really, really critical for deploying AI.
Absolutely. That oversight component, I think, is definitely worth highlighting. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. Amanda, Govind, and Bobby, it's been great to be in conversation with you today. Thrilled in these last few minutes of our time together to hand it over to my colleague, Yamin, who will discuss our recent Aspen cyber products. Yamin, over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Katie. Happy to be here. Very excited to introduce my two new next guests. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Yamin Huq. I'm the Director of US Cybersecurity here at Aspen Digital. And I'm just going to preface this discussion. We're very excited to have this discussion about two papers at the Aspen Cybersecurity program that we've recently launched. So what we really want to do is talk through, what these papers are all about, but more importantly, what the big picture is and what things you can take away in your own work, both private, public, and civil society, in terms of using AI tools within the context of cybersecurity. So we have two papers, and I'll just give you a quick one-liner about them. One is a joint effort by the US Cybersecurity Group and Global Cybersecurity Group called Envisioning Cyber Futures with AI. And basically, as organizations entrust more data to systems enabled by AI, we imagine two particular scenarios, one where AI-powered tools advantage defenders and one where they do the same for attackers. And what this paper does is it uses those possible worlds to determine what kind of policy, carrots, sticks, etc., we can use to get to the better place. The other paper we'll be discussing was created by the Aspen Global Cybersecurity Group, and it is called Generative AI Regulation and Cybersecurity. Basically, Gen AI tools, they can make our lives worse, they can make them better. And what we did was analyze existing regulatory efforts across the world and where their pros and cons are at the intersection of Gen AI and cyber. So the ultimate product of this as well is guidance for governments focused on liabilities, safeguards, and standards. So with that being said, I'd love to introduce the two individuals who were critical in the formation of these papers. We have with us today Jonathan Walburn, who is a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation and faculty member at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. His work includes operations research, computational economics, decision and risk analysis, and on systemic risks and market failures. We also have Jane Horvath, who is a partner at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, as well as the co-chair of the firm's privacy, cybersecurity, and data innovation practice. Prior to that, she was a chief privacy officer at Apple, where she was overseeing Apple's compliance with global privacy laws, as well as general issues relating to cybersecurity. So Jane was actively involved in the Global Cybersecurity Group for the paper on generative AI regulation, and Jonathan was involved in the US group with regards to the envisioning cyber futures with AI. So thank you both for joining us. And so let's talk upfront. So the very first thing I'd love to do is give the audience a concise summary of each of these papers. And by that, I mean, who is the audience for this paper? What would the bottom line be? And what key recommendations and actions do you think anyone reading this paper should take away from it? So I'd love to start with you, Jane.
Sure.
What is the key takeaway of the global paper, Generative AI Regulation and Cybersecurity?
Sure. Our paper focused on generative AI, its regulation and impact on cybersecurity. Our group is comprised of global experts with decades of experience in cybersecurity, and we wanted to offer some observations and advice to governments as they grapple with the implications of Gen AI on cybersecurity. In a world where security breaches can have far-reaching consequences, the synergy between AI and cybersecurity is not merely an option, it is an imperative. Like any transformative technology, Gen AI creates new attack vectors, even as it improves defenses. Possible risks include creating deep fakes for fraud and scams, automated phishing and social engineering, impersonating identities online, generating malicious code and content, evading AI-based detection systems. However, Gen AI can also counter these threats by detecting generated content and malicious use. As governments dash to install legal and regulatory safeguards, organizations should adopt a multifaceted approach that includes robust testing, ongoing monitoring, threat modeling, and ethical considerations. Additionally, combining AI with human expertise in maintaining a proactive stance in cybersecurity practices remains crucial to safeguarding digital assets and systems. Finally, these technologies only benefit cyber defenders if they're adopted. It is critical that policymakers consider procurement approaches that enable the adoption of innovative security technologies. Past efforts have shown that consistent approaches across like-minded nations provide the foundation to successful governance driving better security.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And Jonathan, would you like to give us an overview of envisioning cyber futures with AI?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Yameen. So this paper is jumping right into that conversation that's been fueled by the release of large language models that really brought this wave of attention on AI that kind of felt like a sea change for cyber. And I think that we are in general talking about all of the different uses of AI here rather than a specific type, and acknowledging the fact that as was discussed in the last panel, that cyber has used AI for quite a while. But at the high level, this paper is speaking to organizations that are deploying AI tools, to the policy community, to the community of cyber defenders. I'm a researcher. I would say that there's even some pieces in this paper that kind of speak to that community as well, to build upon. The paper definitely speaks to the challenges of AI and acknowledges the fact that it can and will be weaponized to increase both the amplitude and the frequency of malicious activity in cyberspace. In some places, like disinformation or advanced targeting or phishing attacks, we know that there's some real tangible risks that the paper talks to. But it also speaks towards more of a positive side, and I think this is kind of a unique and cool feature of this paper, of some of the uses of AI. The paper highlights ways in which defenders can actually regain this advantage over attackers by leveraging AI tools, basically to their advantage. And here the paper actually lays out several recommendations, I think too many for me to remember and spout out for you all. And I think Yameen told me to keep it in 90 seconds. But some of those include my favorite one, avoiding the hype. That's the first recommendation. And I love that because it's as much about security as it is about having a coherent strategy, organizational strategy. They also include making sure that cyber and AI practitioners are collaborating and avoid working in silos. They include making sure that cyber defenders are prioritizing logs in order to aid in detecting the more sophisticated AI-enabled attacks. And they include transparency around the use of AI.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, I want to bring discussion now that we've laid out this foundation to the talk of first principles, right? What are the kind of the key, hierarchical recommendations that we can use to think about the relationship between cyber and AI? In one of the papers, we refer to these as, quote, the bumper sticker recommendations, right? And it could be things like being transparent in a thoughtful way, incorporating rules around the use of AI when developing contracts. There's also, in the generative AI paper, we discussed, what works best in cybersecurity and how we can apply that to AI. So, Jane, my first question to you is, what do these first principles in AI mean to you? And what can we take over? What can we look at that's being done already in the space of cybersecurity and apply those best practices within the context of AI?
Sure. Sure. Well, I think if we're looking at, and this is something we have recommended in the paper, that in order to generate effective government action, you want to start with the end user in mind. The prevailing narrative surrounding AI often centers on industry and governmental concerns, such as assessing its macroeconomic impact on the labor market or the necessity of regulations, licensing, and risk frameworks. These discussions are undoubtedly important, but they can overlook the immediate needs of and risk to individuals. The reality is that most individuals lack the means to adequately protect themselves. Individual education, both for users of Gen AI and the general public, operates with a lag and struggles to keep pace with the breakneck speed of technological advancement. So critically, keeping the end user in mind is probably the most important as governments are looking at this. Another area they need to look is assess criminal and civil liability. The ease and efficiency that makes Gen AI popular with the general public applies equally to those who would use it for nefarious purposes. Current laws were written without consideration of Gen AI, and in many cases before it was even imagined. At a minimum, governments should review current statutes to see if they need revision to account for these developments and the legal disputes that could come with them. Third, consider technology safeguards and feasibility. Any regulatory and legal safeguards proposed must be flexible to keep up with technological advances. A few key concepts should be at the core of all safeguards being considered over and above data security. Again, the end user should know when they're engaging with an AI system. Discrimination and bias must be minimized and eliminated if possible. Transparency and information sharing concerning vulnerabilities, potential dangers, and inappropriate uses are critical. Human-controlled breakpoints must be in place when AI is utilized in critical systems, such as health and safety of humans, national security, or other critical matters, and standards need to be established. One of the cautions, and then I know we're running out of time, is consent fatigue. We need to be very, very cognizant, and this is something we've learned from past laws, particularly privacy laws, that if we put up too many consent boxes, people get confused, they get frustrated, sometimes they just say yes without knowledge. So that is going to be one of the areas we're going to have to really grapple with as we look at this space.
Excellent. Jonathan, same question to you, and I'd also love to tie it into, you've done a lot of work around supply chain risk and cybersecurity as well. So if you're able to discuss a little bit about, where you think AI tools can have an impact, both positive and negative in that space too, and what kind of recommendations we can take from that.
Yeah, I mean, so just to give a nod to the structure of this paper, so we had these kind of two scenarios. It's kind of a cool read. It was fun to participate also, where we had the good place on one side, where we're talking about the benefits of AI to AI defenders, and the bad place on the other side, where AI is benefiting more attackers and defenders. And one could read about this in more detail in the report, but we're kind of laying out some of those benefits that defenders would have, and I think that kind of agreeing with the last panel too, that there might be net benefit there, and on some of those points that we kind of think that, just totally agreeing with all of Jane's points on first principles and building on those, that defenders might actually have this larger capacity when we're actually using the AI tools, as well as having adequate education. The defenders have this larger capacity as far as both in terms of labor and as far as capital for training models, and actually sticking to the best practices as far as response and detection. But I think that there's actually improvements here where that this paper talks to, where we might have real gains in response time through improved pattern recognition, real gains in detection quality that might up the overall defenses. And you nodded to this point where we recently had this report that I ran on cybersecurity and supply chain risk. And in that discussion, talk about a lot of things. I wish we had envisioned the AI wave when we started that, but we didn't. But some of the things that we were talking about there were really that the supply chain is effectively a widening of the attack surface for every organization. One could oversimplify that and say that you're only as strong as your weakest link in your supply chain, and that's both attacks the two supply chain participants and attacks that propagate through your supply chain in both a digital and physical sense. And some of these recommendations where we're seeing where there's benefits towards defenders in terms of both these improvements in detection and response, these amplifications of cyber defenders, and Amanda made this point earlier about AI as a force multiplier, as well just stronger code throughout the ecosystem. I think all of these are points where we could lead to real gains that strengthen each of the nodes in the supply chain in ways that we really hadn't even imagined when we were writing that supply chain paper.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So this has been a great discussion. John and Jane, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And I'm kicking it back to Jeff.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks to our panelists and their time. We really appreciate it. Great discussion. Just final plug, if folks want to take a look at our paper on the Aspen Digital website, our 2 papers, please do. And also, if you're interested just generally with background on AI and how to talk about it, some of our Aspen Digital colleagues did some great AI primers, which you can also find on the Aspen Digital website. We will continue to work on this issue, AI, and other cybersecurity issues beyond it. We're trying not to lose focus on the rest of them. So stay tuned for more from the Aspen Cyber Program, and on our website, you can also sign up for a newsletter. Thanks again for our panelists, for our staff, for pivoting here, and I hope everyone goes out and enjoys the snow day. Take care.